In this lesson, we're going to learn how to create direct connections between scripts and objects directly in our inspector and in Unity. So I've just opened up this 04 begin, and it's just a slightly modified scene, and I've opened up our entity spawner script, and I've gone in and removed a lot of the code. So you can find that under 04 begin. So if we go to our spawner, we want this script to grab our enemy object and then create it wherever the spawner is. So for example, here in our hierarchy, we have these spawn points inside each of these little holes. And each of them is a prefab with the spawner script on them. So we need to get a object or a prefab to spawn. And that prefab is under the prefabs folder, and it's this enemy underscore PFB or prefab, and we can see it here. And it just has all of its scripts and animations on it. I'm going to remove that. And so we need to let the spawn point know what kind of enemy we want to grab. So let's begin by declaring a variable as we have in the last lesson. So we'll declare our variable, and let's just say enemy to spawn. And we don't really know what this is going to be, so one of the most general types that we can use or we can cast into is a game object. And those are relatively secure, and almost everything lives on some kind of game object. Okay, so we have our variable enemy to spawn game object. Let's save that and jump over here. And when Unity updates, we should now see this enemy to spawn none. And now instead of actually connecting this in our script, we can create a direct connection here inside of Unity. So we can do that by either clicking this and then going into our assets or our scene and selecting which one we want. So let's see here, we want the enemy prefab, or we can actually just left click and drag this onto this line from our project or our hierarchy. And since these are prefabs, let's hit apply so that we can, or so that all of these spawn points get updated with that enemy prefab here. And so now that we have this object, we can essentially do anything with it. However, since this object is a prefab, it's not yet in our hierarchy. So for it to begin doing anything, we need to create it. And we can do that by instantiating it, by essentially creating a copy in our hierarchy. So inside of our spawn enemy function, let's create a copy of our enemy to spawn. So let's type instance. And it looks like none of the default, or it looks like Mono doesn't have what we're looking for. And what we're looking for is the instantiate function here. So you can see that, instantiate. So instantiate, and open bracket, or excuse me, open parens, and we need the original as an object. So our enemy to spawn. And then we need a position. So since this script is on our spawn point, we want it to spawn in this position. So let's put this transform. So let's see here. We want the transform dot position of this object. And then we need the rotation as well. So we can do transform dot rotation. Close parentheses, semicolon, and hit save. And so now our script should run, and we should be able to instantiate whatever script or whatever object we plug into our enemy to spawn. And we can see that our enemies are now being spawned by all of our spawn points. We can really quickly change this by going in and let's say we want to spawn a goo egg. This doesn't have any scripting or any animation on it, but if we hit play, we'll be able to see those created inside of our hierarchy. And if we go take a look, we can see them created in our spawn points. Okay, great. So in this way, with this direct connection inside of the inspector, is probably one of the easiest ways to create connections from objects to other objects. However, there are a few downfalls or a few problems that come with this. For example, the first problem is if we don't set this correctly, and so let me just set this to none, and hit play, there's a high probability or a high chance that our script will break. And it didn't break that time because we actually have some random values. But if we apply this to all of our spawners, it's going to try to call a function on an object that doesn't exist. So you can see here we're getting an unassigned reference exception. And that's because we're trying to run code on something that we're not setting. So even when I use this method, I always like to have a fallback inside of the code. I believe you can see something like this in the spawn controller. Well, this essentially has what I'm talking about. We can see here that we declare the game state object here, and then we plug it in inside of the script. Usually, even if I'm doing a direct connection inside of the Unity editor, I will still create an if statement inside of my awake function or my start function to test and make sure that I have set this variable. Because if we let this variable stay as null, as you can see, problems happen and our code begins to break whenever we try to access that object. And actually, not in the spawn controller, if we jump over to the game state start function, we can see what I'm talking about here. So here, we check to make sure everything is set. So even though I know I want to manually connect the player in, I check here, if the player controller variable is null, then we know we need to go in and find that game object. And so adding in that just little one piece of check makes sure that you can find your objects when you're trying to access them in your code. So to connect two scripts together, two components together, it's a very simple process. If we jump over to our spawner, we can see all we need to do is create an empty variable, either with the game object to access the parent game object, and then we can use the getComponent function we found in the last lesson, or we can give this the specific name of a script or the component that we want. So for example, if we wanted to grab our player's transform, we could type in var player transform and give it a type of transform, and then save that out. Jump back to our script here, and we should be able to see that come back into play. And so now it's only going to accept an object that has a transform on it. So if we grab our player and drop that on, we now have access to the transform component of that player. If we want to access the health of the player in our script, all we need to do is create a new variable to hold that connection. So let's say player health, and we need it of type whatever the script name is called, and we can see here it's called health, so let's type that in. And then to access that from our spawn points, all we need to do is drag on a game object with that script on it. And we can see it connects to that script or that component on that game object. So this is an incredibly useful tool inside of our toolbox, but it is a little bit labor intensive. For example, if these spawn points weren't prefabbed, I'd have to go into each of them and set all of these values if I wanted to change them. And we can get around this by finding them in the script or using any of the other methods to connect these game objects together. But creating a variable to hold it and then connecting it in the inspector is by far the easiest way to test functionality quickly. So in the next lesson, let's take a look at how we can automate some of this by using the various find methods to search through our hierarchy and connect our scripts together up at actual runtime.